So, one of the secrets to a great movie, and honestly to a director's career, is kind of like an unspoken hero of narrative that is the editor. And when you're younger, I mean, I didn't know this, but when you look behind the scenes of a lot of very successful directors, there's usually a fantastic editor that they work with pretty consistently. The best example that I can think of is the Star Wars movies, because you can see a difference in the quality of the movies. When George Lucas was married to his ex-wife, she was editing a lot of his movies, editing the ideas, editing even the script. Um, and then when she's no longer involved, right? The quality of the movies, you can still see the framework that was built, but the eye that frames the framework was very different. And the reason why I think this is important for victims of abuse is because we've been having this discussion over many videos about who is whose lens are you using to look at yourself? Whose narrative and frameworks are we accepting as reality? The abuser wants to put themselves in the position of telling you who you are, being a mirror to you, and telling you that that's truth and reality, when actually they're like a weird, distorted funhouse mirror, and what they're showing you to yourselves is the most grotesque version of you it could possibly be. And then if you don't accept this as truth, there's something wrong with you. You're deficient. Maybe they'll call you a narcissist. Ah. A lot of victims of abuse get accused of being the abuser. So when you're in kind of these distortion fields of the abuser, it can be very hard to kind of get back to centering yourself inside of your perspective of yourself and the world, centering your perspective of yourself above other people's. And we even had someone come on the subreddit who was big mad about something. They were emotionally triggered and they were, hot typing and making accusations toward me. And then they were upset that I wasn't accepting what they were saying as being true. And it's like, why should I accept what you're saying? You don't know me, you don't know my work. Um, you're a stranger. That entitlement to feel that a stranger should take on what you're saying as the truth is certainly a very interesting choice. And again, in this specific circumstance, that person was feeling emotionally triggered. So like I understood it. But at the same time, when we're thinking about like whose influence are we accepting? Whose ideas about ourselves are we centering inside of ourselves? Like these are really important. And I really kind of came to understand that so much of how we start to build our narrative of the world is based on how we are our own editors. So just like a director, because directors nowadays, they're not filming on film anymore, and the terabytes of data is cheap, essentially. I think unless they're filming for IMAX. Um, but it's essentially like, so they now are like, oh, I'll just get everything. I'll get everything. And then we can, that way when I'm in the booth, the editing booth, I'll have everything that I want. And what ends up happening is you have so much data. You might even have too much. And so then it gets harder to make that like cohesive, consistent narrative of the story. But I mean, editors are they're doing the most, doing the best. A lot of editors actually are women. Another thing I didn't know. And so anyway, we have ourselves so much information and data around us, right? And then we go, okay, what data do I want to take in? And I've talked about it from a paralegal perspective before, which is I often like to go to the experts, people who know what they're talking about. At this point, if someone's like super reactive with an opinion, you know, I okay, oh, I'm not gonna weight that very heavily, depending on who it is, of course. But I personally am like, okay, how do I pare down the information that I take in so that I can even begin to make sense of it? So you are in a sense your own editor. And I was watching a movie called Away We Go many, many years ago. Actually, it was when I was still married to my son's father, and we both really loved this movie. It's got Maya Rudolph and John Krasinski, and it's like an indie movie. And I had this experience watching the movie where I was like, "Oh my gosh, the way the lens of the camera works, the way the music is accompanying what's happening, the way it's edited, it all creates this really beautiful story about what's really truly not that big of a story, but it becomes so beautiful because of the way the narration occurs. And so that started to help me shift kind of like my own internal frame of like how I look at things. What is the narrative I'm building? What is the story I'm building? Because it literally was the two of them in a car driving, not just a car, like a shitty car. They're driving in a shitty car and they're going down the road and they're driving in silence, and the vistas aren't even particularly beautiful, but there was something about that moment where it was like the music that was playing and the way it was shining on their face, or the lens was kind of on their faces and you could kind of see the background, and you just had this sense of an emotional feeling of how they were together in that moment, and what an adventure it was, and also kind of like this bittersweet sad moment because they were leaving the place they'd always been, going, hoping to find a new place where they could have a family. um and I was like, wow, are all these boring moments I have in my life, would those be more cinematic? Would that be more emotionally resonant if there was just the right lens and just the right music, right? So that sort of planted the seed for the things that I'm talking about now. Where I've been, because I was raised by abusers, and they essentially they give you this template of how to look at yourself, which is the worst way to look at yourself, this very negative way. You look at yourself from the absolute worst perspective. You interpret everything about yourself from the absolute worst perspective, and then you assume that that's reality. And so I would run up against people who were very shocked by the way that I looked at myself. And they're like, "That's not true." And I'm like, "Oh no, but it's objectively true." And I didn't understand I was running this program installed by my abusers, that basically was a haterade program. It's hater. I had been weaponized against myself to look at myself in the worst light possible. The narrative that I had been given about who I was and what I was doing in this world was guiding how I was editing everything that I was looking at. And so I see this so often with victims of abuse. They're they're working with the narrative that the abuser has coerced them into agreeing with, or forced on them, or installed like in childhood. And then now you take in all this information, but you're editing, you're curating the information you're taking in to support this narrative and this worldview, this negative narrative and worldview. And I, I have, I've talked about this before. I have terrible, let me put that in the past, have had terrible self-esteem in terms of like how I look. And I had a dream where I was shown myself like from the outside. And it was really interesting because I had it was like from the perspective of someone who loved me, and it had this like hazy, like 1940s, I don't know, Rita Hayworth kind of, when they get the light on them, and it's like hazy and beautiful. And I was like, oh, I mean, I understood it was an allegory. Like other people who like me, they're not looking at me in the harshest light possible. They're not interpreting anything that I'm doing in the worst way possible. They love me, and then therefore that kind of influences how they're seeing me. And so I realized like, oh, okay, victims of abuse are sitting here looking at themselves in the worst possible way, and then looking out for evidence of how they're like the worst possible person or failing the most or whatever it is. And then, okay, picking that stuff and going, oh, well, it's true, right? When there's terabytes of data that you could be pulling from. And so as a parent, actively sort of engaged in this process with my son. Uh, trying not to come to it from like an overbearing perspective, but basically like, oh no, buddy, like this is, so let's say he's had some like a basketball game and he doesn't feel like he did as well as he did. And it's like, well, but you did these other things, right? Where are we putting our focus? How are we measuring success? And the other thing too is like when you start doing research in history and you realize a lot of these successful people were really successful because there were these other people behind the scenes doing a lot of the work. Um, so I Einstein and Mozart were the two where I was like, wait a minute, I had learned these were prodigies and the most amazing, intelligent people, and that they were the ones who came up with these ideas. And to find out there were people behind the scenes who had provided a lot of the framework, done a lot of the groundwork, done a lot of the assisting work, unsung heroes of these of let's say the theorems and ideas or the musical capacity. Or oh gosh, who's the one that gets on my nerves? I do not like Andy Warhol or freaking Picasso. Those guys suck. I I don't when you go back and you look through history and you see how many of these people like had relationships with each other and they were all just sort of like this weird inner little, clique. Like, how is it that they all happen to all of these incredible people happen to know each other? And then you go, wait a minute, were they that incredible? Are there plenty of other people who are equally as incredible? Like, um, it's the lens. Who has access? Who is creating a narrative of how groundbreaking somebody's work is? And then are there people behind the scenes that are contributing to that? So at this point, anytime I see someone show up and they just seem to be the most amazing, the best, and they don't show their work, like, whose ideas are you standing on? Whose work are you standing on? Oh, is this idea just from you? How did you come to that idea? And I'm not saying I do it like 100% perfectly, but I don't think it's real. I think it's, you've got a Stephanie Germanotti, Lady Gaga, who essentially stole the look of the girl before her that this producer was working with. And she became and inhabited this person. And you're just like, oh my, what is real? Um, so anyway, I think victims of abuse get tricked into thinking that there's this reality about who they are, and it's given to them by people who do not have the best intentions for you, are not looking at you from a perspective of actual love. When you love somebody, you're not nitpicking things to criticize. So if you had a parent, for example, that was nitpicking things to criticize, that parent, as much as they might have wanted to love you, they don't love you. That's not what love is. We're not nitpicking. What is it? Love is patient, love is kind, love keeps no records of wrong. Love doesn't keep a record of wrongs. Like if someone is doing that toward you, um, they may not love you. They don't love you. And it doesn't mean that the love should be there. And that's, I think, sometimes where victims of abuse get really caught up is they go, "Oh, well, I should love this person. I should love them more. I should not keep a record of the wrongs." There shouldn't even really be a record of wrongs anyway. Victims of abuse hear stuff like that and they're like, "Oh, I shouldn't keep a record of wrongs." And then they look past things like getting assaulted or being choked or something. And it's like, no, we're not talking about stuff like that. That is a record of a wrong that should exist. Um, that's letting you know this isn't love. Not that this is a list of things that you need to do. There's a difference between descriptive and prescriptive. Anyway, talked about that in other videos. But just sort of more broadly, think about like what is the narrative that you have within yourself? How have you been editing how you see the world? What justifies that narrative? And how it keeps getting reinforced within yourself, because the abuser is not with you 24/7. But if they can get you to look at yourself this way, to edit your sense of reality that way, they don't have to be. You're doing the work for them. Anyway, I hope this makes sense, and I'll talk to you next time.